Well, the news is not new, but it's still equally good that on the first day of the week, Christ arose from the dead, and that there are plenty of religious leaders who have died throughout human history, but they're all still dead. That's one of the many things that separates Jesus and his religion from all of that on all of the earth. And it's not just this idea that makes our ideas better than someone else's ideas. It's God's ideas, and it puts the things that we believe into a practical context, because we also are going to die, and then we also are going to be raised. And so the songs that we have sung have reminded us of some different parts of that. Higher ground. We're trying to move today higher than we were yesterday, and tomorrow higher than we are today. And the second song really echoes that, to higher ground is being closer and closer. But how do you know if you are as close as you ought to be? You know, there's some things that are outward that we know we are forbidden to do, so we can read those passages and, have I done that? No. Okay, well, then I've avoided that. There's some things, though, that we're told not to do that are a little bit harder sometimes to put our finger on as to whether we're guilty of or not. You know, greedy, covetousness. Sometimes those things can slip up on us if we aren't guarding our attitude. There's other things God tells us to do that, again, they're very outward, and so it's very easy. Either worshiped with the saints on the Lord's Day or I didn't. Either sang or I didn't sing. I either ate and drank and remembered Jesus, or I didn't eat and drink at all, or I ate but I didn't remember Him. There's some things that are like that, just very much external and obvious to ourselves. There's some other things, though, that likewise can be a little bit harder sometimes to gauge and to measure ourselves. They require some thought. So how do we know if we are as near as we ought to be? There are some passages like Romans 12 that mix verses, I think, 9 through 17, that it mixes some things about continuing in prayer and being hospitable. Then there are some other things, though, that are more inward. And 2 Peter 1, 5 through 7 is like that. Add to your faith virtue and knowledge. Again, those are not so much external things that are always so obvious. Tonight we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, from which we just read. Typically, this text is read either as part of a textual study, so come to chapter 3 because you finished chapter 2, or sometimes when a congregation believes that they have at least two men who are prepared to be pastors, elders, overseers, well then, okay, it's time to study this text and see if they're ready, see if we're ready or not. Tonight, I want to suggest that from time to time we should read in our own private study and review 1 Timothy chapter 3, not just to keep in mind the qualities of a man whom the Holy Spirit has chosen to be an overseer, but that we consider the traits, the majority at least, of the traits here as things that ought to be in us. Elders' traits ought to be in every saint. I think it's pretty obvious as you read through these, the majority of the things that God expects of someone who is among one of the leaders of a local church, the majority of what He expects of them are things that God expects of every single Christian. And so let's look at this text tonight, primarily looking at the qualities that God expects of every Christian. In the context, it's things that must be in those who are overseers. But let's look at 1 Timothy 3, and then we'll also look at Titus chapter 1, a few words that are mentioned there that are not in this section of verses, and measure yourself by these things. Whether or not you are going to be an elder one day for whatever the reason, I hope you'll see that this text is one of those texts we can go to from time to time to measure ourselves. Am I where I ought to be? Am I nearer, as we just sang? Is my walk nearer and nearer, and is it where it ought to be? So we're just going to go through the words of 1 Timothy chapter 3. On the chart, I'll have the word of the New King James, the New American Standard. If you use a different version, then have your Bible open, and sometimes just the comparison can sometimes help the words even be maybe a little more clear to us. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, someone who's going to be an overseer, they are to be the husband of one wife. But that doesn't have to be the trade of every saint. But someone who would do the work of a bishop, that would be an overseer, a superintendent would be, that's probably the word we're most familiar with, the superintendent of a school or such. But just an overseer, a pastor, an elder. He is to be, the first thing that is mentioned, is to be blameless. So it's easy to see why someone accepting that role and that responsibility needs to be blameless. But turn to 1 Timothy 5 and verse 7. And as Paul is telling Timothy about the responsibilities of a family who has a widow in their family, he says that these things command that they may be blameless. So he's not talking about the widow, but he's talking about the family of a widow. And he says that family needs to be blameless. And then in chapter 6 and verse 14, he's told Timothy in verse 12 to fight the good fight of faith. And he says in verse 14 that you keep this commandment without spot, blameless until our Lord Jesus Christ's appearing. So in the book of 1 Timothy, you've got not the widow, but it would apply to her too, but the family of a widow, her children and their families. And then Timothy, he's addressed as a young man. Well, they're told to be blameless. Exactly the same word as an overseer is told to be blameless. Blameless, is it not, a trait for every saint? Back to 1 Timothy 3. Next he says, and again you'll have some maybe variety in your translation, but temperate. This word is also in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, so maybe easy to just jump back there. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 6 says, therefore let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. That word sober, again I'm reading from the New King James. That word sober in 1 Timothy 5 is the same word as temperate in 1 Thessalonians 5 is the same word as temperate in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And you also often find these two words, temperate and sober, or sober and vigilant together. Maybe the more well-known verse is 1 Timothy 5:8. Be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. So if you are under attack or you are being watched, then you should be watching. And while you're watching, be sober, be temperate. That's the point here. So again, while it's easy to see an overseer, that's part of his responsibility is to see, to watch over, to watch out for. So he needs to be temperate and alert in that. That's true. But 1 Thessalonians 5 is written for every Christian. 1 Peter chapter 5 is written for every saint. We also have to be alert that we don't live on an island. There are dangers around us. Some are less obvious. Satan's work, that's unseen. But in the people that are around us and the messages and the ideas that people are trying to communicate to us, whether it's by media or social media or the people we are around, by their language, by their jokes, by their forms of entertainment, whether they realize it or not, they are seeking to influence us. So we need to be aware of our surroundings. Every saint needs to be temperate. Next, that an overseer, a bishop, needs to be sober-minded. New American Standard here says prudent. Turn to Titus chapter 2. And so this, we usually think about sober meaning not influenced, not intoxicated. And that's true, but it doesn't only have that application. It's just the idea of having a clear mind. And so alcohol can cloud our mind, but there would be a variety of things that could do so. Notice in Titus chapter 2 and verse 2, who else is to be sober? That the older men be sober. You see a few other words there. In verse 3, he starts talking to the older women. telling them, verse 5, to teach the younger women to be discreet. And I don't know why the different word is used here, but that word discreet is the same word as sober in verse 2, and it's the same word. The elder, the one who is to be an elder, is to be sober-minded. That means discreet. And the young woman is to be sober-minded, to be discreet. God expects the same thing of the older man as He does of the younger woman. Male, female, young or old, this applies to all. And maybe that's because every phase of life has its own tricks, its own traps, that if we are not temperate, if we're not watching, and if we're not sober, if we're not clear-minded, there's going to be things that would be easy for us to fall into if we're not paying careful attention. And that's true when we're younger, before we're married, in the process of finding maybe someone to marry, of early in our life as being married, having children, every phase of having children, once our children are gone, every phase of life has its own traps. And so we need to be sober-minded so that we see what we need to do. For me, I could say as a parent, well, what are the things that I allow my children to do? And what are the things that I initiate, that I expect that they do? And then what are the things that I'm going to say, we're not going to do that anytime, anywhere. I totally forbid. I've got to be clear-minded. If I go too far in one direction or the other, or I neglect one, then that has consequences on them. And so a parent has to be sober-minded. An overseer and his work has to be over-minded. A young person, a young man, a young woman. This is a trait for every saint. Back to 1 Timothy 3. Again, I'm skipping over some as we go through, only looking at the ones that would have more general application to us. And so next, that an overseer is to be someone of good behavior, New American Standard, respectable. This is also the same word. If you go back to chapter 2 and verse 9, now the case where here he's addressing in particular the women, and that they're told to dress in modest apparel. That word modest, another word for that is orderly, and another word for that is good. It's good behavior. It's the same word as 1 Timothy chapter 3. Again, I don't know why the translation is different, but it's the same basic word. This word would be orderly. And so good orderly behavior, good orderly dress. God has an order, not to the specific garment, but to the matters of the heart, the attitude, and to the matters of what parts of the body, at least to a minimum, that ought to be covered. God has an order for that. And so that's to be reflected in dress, and that's to be reflected in general conduct. And I was trying to think of an example, and I thought of Jesus having good behavior, not just because he wasn't a rabble-rouser and a problem causer in sinful things, but I thought about the way that Jesus taught. People who objectively, fairly viewed him, they could say he was someone of good behavior when he was involved in controversy of a public nature. When there are many eyes on you, it can be a little bit hard you're thinking, well, what are they thinking? And what are those people thinking? But Jesus, in his very public conflicts with the religious leaders, he was of good behavior. When Jesus met privately, sometimes he still gave a rebuke, like in John 3, when he met privately with Nicodemus, and Nicodemus talks about, well, how could a man be born again? And Jesus rebukes him. He says, well, do you not understand these things, being a teacher of the law? And yet that wasn't the same way that he often addressed the other religious leaders. You brood of vipers, or maybe that was John, but you whitewashed tombs. Well, Jesus spoke to different people in different ways according to the occasion. In John chapter 4, the way that he talked to the woman at the well was different than the way that he talked to Nicodemus, was different than the way that he spoke to the Pharisees. See, in public and in private, Jesus' conduct, his conduct was different, but his character was not. Jesus was an example of good behavior. Elders have to be an example of good behavior, as do every one of us. This is a way to measure ourselves. The next thing that comes up in the text is hospitable. And that's pretty much the universal translation. But of course, while we could think about, well, why is it important for someone who's going to be the shepherd, one of the shepherds, an overseer, a pastor, beside other pastors in that congregation? We can think about the benefits and the importance of him being someone who's hospitable. But in Romans chapter 12 and verse 13, the end of that verse says this simply given to hospitality. That's not something that's addressed to the elders in every church. That's something addressed to everyone who also is supposed to let love be without hypocrisy, and who's supposed to continue steadfastly in prayer. That would be every saint, wouldn't it? Even notice, doesn't just say hospitable here in Romans 12, but given to hospitality. I read one person's definition of that, and that word given would mean hunting something, like you're chasing it down, chasing down hospitality. In other words, not waiting for it to find you, not waiting for someone to ask you, but you're looking for an opportunity given to hospitality. Something important for every saint in the eyes of God. Next, back in 1 Timothy chapter 3. So we've sung just a closer walk with thee. What does that closer walk look like? Well, for an overseer, someone has to already be apt to teach or able to teach. And this is one that I think is pretty simple, but taking me some time maybe to be balanced in understanding. To what degree does this one have to be an overseer first? We'll start there. How good of a teacher does he have to be? Does he have to be able to teach publicly? Does he have to be able to teach privately? Does he have to be able to speak before a group of 20? Does he have to be able to speak smoothly? Everyone consider if 200 people are there, everybody has to think he's a really good speaker. Is that what it says? It's rather simple, just apt or able to teach. It doesn't say he has to be able to develop a 3-point outline and to give dictionary definitions of 50% of the terms of the New Testament. Just as someone who's able to teach. Now, when you think about that alongside some of the family qualities of this man, he has children. Can't be a pastor if you aren't married. Can't be a pastor if you don't have children who are of some age. The more I thought about it, every parent has to be able to teach. At least by the time the child is 12, maybe 15, maybe 18. Every parent has to be able to teach. It doesn't mean they've got to be able to teach them math and science and microbiology and mechanical engineering. But to be a parent, you have to be able to know what needs to be taught. And you've got to know how to teach it. In the sense you've got to know about the subject. And then maybe equally important is you've got to know the one that you're teaching well enough to know what do they need to know to be where they need to be. That's an important part of teaching. So can you raise a child in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and by 18 or 21 when they are no longer in your care, can you do that and not be able to teach to any degree at all? I don't think so. So I don't think that this bar is really as high as maybe even I myself in the past have thought that it has to be. Someone needs to be able to look at people and know what they need and know where they are in the process of that, and to be able to help them to learn what they need to know. Every overseer needs to do that. Every parent learns to teach. And so the majority, if not every saint, may not already be able to teach, but we should all be in the process. If we're a Christian, then we know what God has done for us. And we know what God expects of us at a bare minimum to become a Christian. If we are a Christian, we already understand it. So the timeline will be different for everyone. At one point, is a new Christian able to explain to someone else what they themselves have already done? That timeline is different, but everybody should be moving along somewhere in that timeline. So to some degree, every Christian should be either able to teach or moving closer to being able to teach publicly, privately, to some degree. Next, in verse 3, not given to wine. The American Standard saying, not addicted to wine. This and the next two words are all three especially centered around the idea of someone who has self-control and demonstrating that in different ways. And so by not being given, not being addicted, if they're able to avoid that, that's because they have self-control. But of course, that would not only be true for an elder, would it? Because this is the quality of an elder. Does that mean, well, if I'm not an elder, then I can be addicted to wine? Well, clearly not. And then because it says not addicted or given to wine, some people have said, well, does that mean we can drink some just as long as we're not addicted? And as in any topic, well, there are other passages. That isn't what this passage is talking about. But other passages would talk about that. And that's a subject for another time. But just in brief, Ephesians 5:18 says, do not be drunk with wine. So no Christian should be intoxicated. And in America, our beverages, our intoxicating beverages, are made so that if you drink one, guess what happens? You're intoxicated. So that applies to every Christian in that area as well as this one, and not just for the leaders. Next, not given to wine, not violent. We could even see how those might be first or second cousins. The New American Standard said not pugnacious, and that didn't help me any. I had to look that word up. But that means quick to argue, quarrel, or fight. So you could see this also is the idea of having self-control, especially when the screws are a little bit tight and tensions run high and there's some conflict. Then a Christian has to be able to, an overseer is going to have to remain in control of himself when others may not do so. That's important for his oversight and his work, but that's needed by every saint. As well as the next one, not greedy for money. This is also someone who's greedy for money, lacks the self-control that I want more, I'm not content with what I have, and so constantly looking for more or having that ongoing desire for more, and that'll cause a problem for someone doing the work of an overseer. Someone who's going to be overseeing also includes some financial overseeing. So that would cause some problems there. But that will cause problems for any Christian. So not greedy for money would apply to every saint. Okay, so several things to avoid. And then we go back to something, again, pretty general and very basic. Gentle. Look at James chapter 3 and verse 17. Again, we can see why an overseer, someone who is leading, they need to be able to be gentle. In James chapter 3, verse 17, though, this is not written to the pastors, to the elders, but to all saints. James writes, the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Reading that verse, you might say, well, that actually sounds like it would fit in pretty well with 1 Timothy 3. Well, yeah, I think we could all agree everything here would need to apply to someone who's preparing to do the work of an elder. Someone who is not any of these things, is not ready to do that work yet. And yet, in this case, this is addressed to all. Someone ready and able, having the self-control to be gentle. There may be some overlap in some of these words. Back to 1 Timothy 3, not quarrelsome. New American Standard, not contentious. Again, if the elder is always the one causing problems, then he's making his own life harder, his own work more difficult. But every saint has to recognize that. Consider in Romans chapter 14, verses 1 and 5, Paul is writing to the church there in Rome, where apparently there are some quarrels among them. And so one way he's diffusing that is he's giving them some principles of how to identify the things that don't need to be quarreled over. And so verse 1, receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. Well, doubtful things. I mean, some people doubt the existence of God. Does that mean receive them, even if they doubt the existence of God? Now, verse 5, he gives us an example of the kinds of things he's discussing. Verse 5, one person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. So we could easily see in that time maybe a Jew, well, his whole world had always revolved around not working on the Sabbath day. So he might continue to give some personal, private meaning to that day, though he couldn't do it publicly in the way that he always would, in all of the same traditions. But he could still have some private matters of giving some special attention to that day. But if he did, he doesn't need to try to convince everyone else to do that. Nor should someone who doesn't do it try to convince him that, well, no, you need to be working on the seventh day. That's a matter that Paul is explaining in Romans 12, that there doesn't need to be any quarrel over. Yet in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, well, I hear there are divisions among you, and sometimes there does need to be divisions. He says in verse 19, there must be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. So there are some times we have to, not in a sinful way, quarrel, but there are times that we have to argue, we have to stand. The life of Jesus is the perfect example of that. But not such that that's our focus and our constant character, and we're just not enjoying ourselves if we're not quarreling or arguing with somebody with someone about something. That's the character trait that no elder needs to have, no church needs that, but neither does any saint. Next, back to 1 Timothy 3. Last thing that we'll notice here is not covetous. New American Standard saying free from the love of money. So again, someone accepting a responsibility that involves them having more say in the decisions of a group of people, including the money that group is entrusting him with, or the elders with. That would be one among many reasons. Someone who is not covetous. And yet, again, the application is obvious, isn't it? That no Christian ought to be covetous. Jesus taught about that. This is one of those words. It's easy to read that, and it's very easy to think, well, I'm not covetous. And yet, in our culture of luxury, not only do we have luxury, we all, to some degree, expect to have luxuries, and our routines, and even sometimes our work responsibilities that we have accepted it include some luxuries that go along with it. And it's not wrong to have luxuries, but the expectation of those sometimes is a source of problem. And in our culture, as we enter into a few different seasons that sometimes become very heavily focused on getting and not being content with having food and clothing, entering into seasons like that, the parable of the sower, the thorny ground where the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the pleasures of life end up getting more attention than the things that God has said and the things that God has promised and the things that God does teach us to focus on. If they fade into the background for a particular season of the year, then the danger of covetousness may be closer than we realize. So the elder needs to put that away, as does every saint. Let's go over to Titus chapter 1. I'm not going to go through everything here, but there are a few words that don't appear in Titus that are in Timothy, and some that are in Timothy that are not in Titus. And so just notice a few of those here. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 7, a bishop must be blameless as a steward of God. Then we have this, not self-willed. Think about that. Why is it important that an overseer not be self-willed? I mean, after all, again, now he, along with the other elders, that they're the decision makers. So aren't they supposed to be then imposing and determining their will, and everybody's supposed to follow their will? Well, that's not exactly the way to say it, is it? That's not why God has put them into that position. Look at Proverbs chapter 18 on this idea of being self-willed, and how that would apply not only to overseers, but also to every saint. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 1. A man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment. So one reason someone is ready to be a bishop, an overseer, is because they have learned not to be self-willed. They've learned not to isolate themselves. When they have an important decision to make, they have learned to go out and not just listen to advice that someone initiates and offers. There's someone who goes out looking for advice. They're not just willing to listen, they're seeking to listen. And so over the course of time, they've accumulated wisdom, sometimes by their own experience, but also sometimes by the things they've not had to experience because they didn't isolate themselves. And the same is true for all of us. We need to learn to listen, but we also need not to isolate ourselves and, well, I can handle it. I can do this on my own. I don't need your help. I don't need your advice. I don't need your hands. Well, no, that's self-will. Proverbs 18 verse 1, don't isolate yourself where you're going to figure it out all on your own. There's a reason God has given us a family, other Christians, not self-willed, but every saint. Learning to listen, seeking to listen. Back to Titus 1, not quick-tempered. Again, easy to see. You need the supervisor at work. He needs to be someone when everybody else is things are falling apart. He's the one that keeps his head, and he can direct everybody where they need to go, and he doesn't lose it. Not quick-tempered. Look at James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Again, James addressing every believer. James 1, 19 and 20. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. I know I can see the busier I am, then the harder it is not to be quick-tempered. And so what I have to learn is somehow I have to be busy and not be quick-tempered, or I have to be less busy so that I am not quick-tempered. I've got to be able to do one or the other. If I put myself in a position to be quick-tempered, then I'm putting myself in a position to sin. Not quick-tempered, important in every heart. Another one where at first we might think, well, it's so general. I mean, who's the Christian who would say, well, no, I'm not a lover of what is good, I just follow the Lord. These are things apparently intended to stir some thought that are kind of like the parables. To understand them and to benefit from them, you had to give some more additional thought to what was said and not just walk away quoting what Jesus said, and so then you automatically understand it. What is a lover of what is good? That made me think of Psalm 1, verses 1 and 2, where God promises to bless the man who doesn't walk, stand, or sit with the sinner and the scornful and the ungodly. But verse 2, the reason he doesn't, because he doesn't delight in the things that they do. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. Maybe that's something then we can chew on a little bit more. Am I a lover of what is good? Initially, we'd all say yes. Okay, well, here's one test of that. what do I dwell on? What do I meditate on day and night? Again, it doesn't mean I can't hold a job that requires me to think about something other than Bible verses. That's not the point. But throughout the day, and not just going through a checklist of, once a week, but every day, my circumstances, my responsibilities, they take my mind in this direction or that direction. But every day, I'm directing my attention to meditate on His law. And then maybe sometimes that's hard to do. It's a challenge to do. My mind is pulled in other directions and other interests and other things that I really, really enjoy. But then over time I learn, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. I need those things more than sometimes I realize I do. And I need those things maybe more than other things that might be more pleasurable, more enjoyable, more fun, more entertaining, but they're not so beneficial. But I delight in the law of the Lord because of who they're from and why they're given, and in light of some of the results that they bring that we talked about this morning. So an overseer needs to be someone who is a lover of what is good, as does every disciple. The next two are also pretty general. Paul writes to Titus, it says that a bishop is to be just. This would be the same word as righteous. And so someone who does what is right. Someone who God has made right. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 7 says that he who practices righteousness is righteous. So how can I be righteous? Not self-righteous, but God is the one who can make us righteous. How? Well, by practicing the things that are just, both outwardly and inwardly. That's how God continues to change us and make us just. Holy is another one of those. Well, am I holy or am I not holy? Am I growing in holiness? It's kind of general. Peter says in 1 Peter 1 and verse 16, "Be holy, for I am holy." So how do I measure my holiness, the degree of holiness? Well, I measure myself by who God is. And of course, I'm never going to be on an equal plane with God. But I look at God's holiness, and I look at what is missing in mine, and I grow and strive and work towards holiness, because this is a trait of every saint. Like in Titus chapter 1, several things that Paul told Timothy related to self-control. But then here to Titus, he just would include, they would all be included in this expression of someone who is self-controlled at the end of verse 8. Again, another passage that talks about self-control, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul is not writing to the overseers and not writing to the Corinthians to tell them, here's how you identify someone who's ready to be one of the bishops among you. But in 1 Timothy 9 and verse 25, he says, "But everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown." You might even have a footnote there for temperate. My Bible does. And the footnote says someone who exercises self-control. In this case, this word temperate relates to having self-control. In the context of what Paul is saying here, if you're in a race, and if the prize or that race is more important to you than anything else, then you're not going to let anything interfere with your training that is not related to that race. You're not going to let anything, once you're in the race, there's nothing you're not going to let anything of lesser importance sidetrack you. You're not going to stop and check your email and stop and check your text messages during the race. No, you exercise self-control. I'll just have to figure that out later. Right now, my eyes are on the prize. My eyes are on the goal. And so I just have to block some things out right now. And that's the life, the entire life of a Christian. We are in a race. And there's some things I can't do at all. And so I have self-control. There's some things I just can't do yet. I can't do right now because there's other things that are more important in this race that I'm in. And so what motivates me to say no, completely no? What motivates me to say, well, maybe, but just not yet, not right now? The trait of an elder, whether I am one or not. And then last, in Titus chapter 1 and verse 9, it says that an elder needs to be someone holding fast the faithful word. It's obvious why someone who is leading a local church has to hold fast the faithful word. Turn to Matthew chapter 6. And again, let's find the same word expressed as an expectation of every Christian. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Again, reading from the New King James, where it says, you will be loyal to the one. The King James and the New American Standard translate that, he will hold to one and despise the other. And again, we have the same word. An elder is to be someone holding fast the faithful word. Well, Jesus says that whoever would be, in this case, whoever would be my disciple, has to be someone who holds fast to me and doesn't hold fast to treasures, to earthly riches, to the priorities of this earth and of this world. Interesting way that Paul worded that. Could have said holding fast to the faithful God. We sang that song this morning. Great is thy faithfulness. God is faithful. He could have referred to God. He implies that, but the way he words it is the faithful word. The word of God is faithful. The word of God deserves our trust, our confidence. If that's what God said, then that's what God means. When I understand what God expects me to do, I don't have any reason to doubt it or to do differently or to try to change it regardless of what my thoughts were in the past, my practice was in the past. I need to fit myself to the faithful word because it is what God has spoken. God's word is faithful. And so what other word do we have more confidence in? Are the words of any other expert more meaningful to us? Do we look to someone else, a friend, a professional even, and what they say we would consider and be more committed to than what God has said? Paul says this is the faithful word. In other words, it deserves our full confidence. And if someone's going to be an overseer, someone's going to do the work with others of a pastor, then they need to hold fast the faithful word. And if our heart is set in heaven, if our treasure is set in heaven, then we are loyal. Our heart is set upon that same word. So from time to time, read these texts and notice that these are not intended only to be the qualities of someone doing the work of an elder. But I want you to see also, though, these are not long-term goals. Well, one day I'll be blameless, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. After I've been a Christian for a few decades, then these will be the things that God will see in me. Doesn't mean my whole life changes tomorrow, but these are the things that God is looking for. These are the things that God promises to build in us if this is where our heart will be. Part of the challenge, again, is reading some of these, some of them being so general. Sometimes we just have to camp out on one. And what does that mean? And what would it look like in my life if it was present? What would my life look like if that's absent from my life? And then recognizing the presence of these traits in me today doesn't guarantee that I'm blameless tomorrow, temperate tomorrow, that I am gentle tomorrow. Having them today, if I'm looking for a closer walk with Him, means I prepare to do the same things tomorrow. So as we sing this song, number 280, you ask yourself, are these traits in you? And what's going to happen this week? Is there something someone else could say or do that would change you, that you would not act consistent in these ways? Or are you growing in them, and whatever good, whatever bad may happen, by faith, all it's going to do is reinforce these things in your conduct, in your confidence in God, in your faith. One of the goals of this church, I trust, that we share is having elders. This church needs elders. But more than we need elders, we need the traits of elders in each one of us. Examine your heart, examine your conscience as we sing this song. If there is sin in you, and you need that forgiveness that God offers, that His Son came and lived and died and was resurrected in order to forgive, then if you're not a Christian, because you haven't confessed your faith, because you have not been baptized, then we want to help you and encourage you to act upon that faith tonight. Or as a Christian, if your life has not been in the Lord as it ought to be, and maybe as it once was, if you're lost in your sin again, then return to Him and He'll accept you back. If we can help you in any way, come forward and tell us how as we stand and sing 280.